The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges, and smelled faintly of mildew. The handwriting on it was jagged, as if the pen had been gripped too tightly. It simply read, Peter Willis. There was no return address. Peter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope with unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. For weeks now, he'd been researching cold cases, digging into Illinois' most infamous murders for an article that might finally launch his career. But the name John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, kept pulling him in deeper. Every time he thought he had enough material, some new thread would appear, dragging him further into the abyss. And now this envelope, delivered by hand, not mail, was sitting on his kitchen table like a gift no one wanted to open. He took a breath, slid a knife under the seal, and pulled out a single piece of paper. A photograph fluttered out and landed face up on the table. It showed a man in clown makeup, grinning ear to ear, but the smile was cracked, uneven, as if the skin was splitting beneath the paint. Peter recognized the face immediately. John Wayne Gacy. But this wasn't one of the usual mugshots or crime scene photos. This was different. Gacy's eyes stared directly into the lens, too alive, too aware. His grin looked more like a warning. Peter shoved the photograph aside and unfolded the letter. The words, scrawled in jittery ink, felt like a riddle. They told you he died. They lied. He's waiting, Peter, and I know where to find him. The signature at the bottom was a name Peter barely remembered. Darren Gacy. A chill ran through Peter's spine. Darren was a distant cousin, someone he had met once at a family gathering over a decade ago. They hadn't stayed in touch, and Peter had almost forgotten his existence, until now. Why would Darren, of all people, be writing to him about one of the most infamous serial killers in history? Below the message, Darren had scribbled an address, 307 Southfield Road, Crawford County. Peter leaned back in his chair, the letter still clutched in his hand. He had heard of Crawford County, a forgotten patch of land riddled with abandoned houses and the ghosts of bad memories. Gacy's body had been buried 6 feet deep, cremated, and scattered into oblivion. Everyone knew that. And yet, as Peter sat there, the letter burning in his hands, an unease began to settle over him, like the first gust of wind before a storm. 2 days later, Peter was on the road, the landscape shifting from urban decay to rural emptiness. The farther he drove, the more the towns seemed to rot away, each one smaller, more desolate, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. Rusted trailers sat half-buried in mud, their windows shattered and curtains fluttering like old skin. Signs on long-abandoned gas stations creaked in the wind, promising cold beer and cheap cigarettes to no one. Peter gripped the wheel tighter as a strange anxiety gnawed at him. Darren's words echoed in his mind. He's waiting, Peter, and I know where to find him. By the time Peter reached 307 Southfield Road, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the crumbling driveway. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its windows boarded up, and the paint peeling away in long, jagged strips. A single light flickered in the upstairs window. Peter killed the engine and sat there, staring at the house. For a moment, he considered leaving, just turning the car around and heading back to Chicago, away from whatever madness Darren had dragged him into. But then he saw something, or thought he did. A figure moved behind one of the windows, just a shadow, really, but it was enough to set Peter's heart racing. He wasn't alone. The door creaked open under Peter's hand, revealing a dim hallway that smelled of mold and rotting wood. The wallpaper was peeling, curling like dead skin, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Peter hesitated in the doorway, listening to the silence. Somewhere in the house, water dripped steadily, tap, 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 like the ticking of an invisible clock. "Darren," Peter called out, but his voice felt small in the emptiness. No answer. He moved deeper into the house, each step drawing him further from the safety of the open door. The walls were lined with framed photographs of clowns. But these weren't happy or friendly faces. They were twisted, distorted, with makeup smeared into grotesque smiles. Some of the faces looked human, but others seemed to shift under Peter's gaze, as if their features were trying to rearrange themselves into something more monstrous. He found Darren sitting in the living room, hunched over a tattered notebook. The man looked terrible, his hair greasy and unkempt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. A cigarette burned between his fingers, untouched, its ash trailing down like a gray scar. "You came," Darren whispered without looking up. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I didn't think you would." Peter stood awkwardly in the doorway. "What is this, Darren? What the hell is going on?" Darren finally looked up, and Peter felt a shiver crawl down his spine. There was something off about Darren's eyes, something wild and desperate, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. "He's not gone, Peter," Darren whispered, his voice trembling. "They buried him, but they didn't stop him. He's still here. I've seen him." Peter stared at him. "Gacy? What are you talking about? He's been dead for years." Darren let out a hollow laugh. "That's what they want you to believe. But I know the truth. I've seen him, Peter. In my dreams. In the walls. He's waiting. And he's hungry." Before Peter could respond, Darren stood up abruptly and grabbed his arm. His grip was cold, his nails digging into Peter's skin. "You have to be careful," Darren hissed, his eyes wide with terror. "Once you start digging, you can't stop. He won't let you." Peter pulled away, unsettled by the manic fear in Darren's voice. "This is insane," he muttered. Darren shook his head. "It's not. You'll see. He's already watching you." Peter's mouth went dry. "Watching me?" Darren smiled, a twitching, nervous grin that stretched his lips too wide. "You'll feel it soon enough. The itch under your skin, the laughter in your head. That's how it starts." Peter tried to sleep that night on Darren's couch, but the house wouldn't let him. The walls creaked and shifted, and every time he closed his eyes, he heard distant laughter, soft at first, but growing louder as if coming from just behind the walls. At some point, he drifted off, only to wake with a jolt, gasping for air. His hands were covered in dirt, and the taste of soil lingered on his tongue. His heart raced as a horrible thought clawed its way into his mind. Something was watching me while I slept. And Darren was gone. Peter sat on his couch, staring at the worn VHS tape resting in his hands. The words, "Pogo's Secrets," were scrawled across the white label in jagged handwriting. He found it sitting on his doorstep this morning, wrapped in newspaper and twine. There was no note, no sender, just the tape, waiting for him like an unwanted memory clawing its way out of the past. He knew he should throw it away. burn it, forget it ever existed. But he didn't. Instead, Peter slid the tape into his old VCR, heart hammering in his chest. The screen flickered to life with static, the hum of the machine loud in the quiet apartment. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the screen rippled and an image began to take shape. A clown stared back at him. John Wayne Gacy. Gacy sat in front of the camera, grinning from ear to ear in his clown persona. Pogo. His white makeup cracked at the edges, the red paint around his mouth smeared into jagged lines that stretched unnaturally wide, as if someone had taken a knife to his face and carved the grin deeper. His eyes glimmered with something vile, something alive and far older than the man wearing the makeup. "Hello, boys and girls," Gacy said cheerfully, his voice carrying an eerie sing-song quality. He adjusted the oversized clown bow tie at his neck, tilting his head to the side. "Pogo's here to tell you a little secret, a magic secret. Wanna know how I keep smiling? The screen flickered, and for an instant, the frame glitched, warped. Gacy's grin stretched wider, his painted lips curling back until Peter swore he saw teeth beneath the paint. Teeth that weren't human, yellowed, jagged like the fangs of some hungry animal. Gacy leaned closer to the camera as if sharing a private joke. "You see, the trick to a smile is knowing how to sew it on tight. If you don't..." He jerked his head sharply, and a wet ripping sound filled the speakers. "Well, let's just say things can get messy." Suddenly, the screen cut to black. Peter exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. His hands were shaking, but he couldn't look away. The black screen flickered, and then, without warning, the scene changed. Now the camera was pointed at a poor child's birthday party. A group of children sat in a semicircle on the floor, their faces obscured by strange shadows. Gacy, still in his pogo persona, stood in the center, waving a colorful balloon. But something was wrong. The children weren't smiling. Their mouths were open as if they were screaming, but there was no sound. The tape jumped again, the footage crackling with static. When the image returned, the children were gone. Gacy stood alone in the frame, grinning that terrible grin. His hands, stained with something dark, were tucked behind his back. "Where did they go, you ask?" Gacy whispered, his voice low and conspiratorial. He leaned even closer to the camera, his painted face filling the screen. "They're right here, right under your skin." The screen dissolved into static, and then the tape ended, abruptly, without credits or explanation. Just silence. Peter sat motionless on the couch, his pulse racing. He felt like he'd just stared into a nightmare that was far from over. Peter turned off the TV, but the silence that followed was oppressive. His apartment felt wrong, as if the walls were leaning closer, listening. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just a tape, just some disturbing artifact from the past. But then he heard it. Laughter. Soft, distant, and high-pitched. It echoed through his apartment, bouncing off the walls. Peter's skin prickled as goosebumps rose along his arms. He checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were shut tight. There was no one else here. And yet, the laughter persisted. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the apartment. Peter stumbled into the bathroom, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He splashed cold water on his face and stared at himself in the mirror. His reflection gazed back, pale and exhausted. But something wasn't right. His face, his mouth looked strange. He leaned closer to the mirror, his breath fogging the glass. For a moment he thought it was just the stress, but then he saw it. His lips were starting to curl into a smile, a grin that wasn't his own. Peter gasped and rubbed at his face, trying to wipe away the expression. But the more he rubbed, the tighter the smile seemed to cling, like it had been sewn there, just as Gacy had warned. His reflection in the mirror blinked at him. But Peter didn't blink back. That's when he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Peter unplugged the VCR and threw the tape into a drawer, but it was too late. The laughter followed him throughout the night, soft, childlike giggles that echoed through the walls, growing louder whenever he tried to sleep. He tossed and turned on his bed, suffocating beneath his blanket, until the room felt like a coffin. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, the nightmares came. He was trapped in a dark room. The walls lined with mirrors. In each reflection, he saw himself, but not quite. His mirrored selves wore Pogo's painted grin, their eyes glassy and lifeless, their mouths stretched too wide. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the endless laughter. Gacy's laughter. Loud and shrill, ringing through the mirrors like a child's broken music box. Peter awoke, gasping for air, his bedsheets tangled around him like a straitjacket. His body ached, as if he'd been twisting and writhing in his sleep. And that's when he noticed the bite marks. They were small but deep, dotting the length of his arms like a twisted constellation. The skin was bruised purple and red, with tiny indentations that looked unmistakably like teeth marks. But they weren't human, not exactly. The teeth had been too sharp, too jagged. Peter's stomach churned as he inspected the marks. His hands were caked with dirt again, black soil, as if he'd been digging all night. But there were no tools in his apartment, no dirt anywhere. Just his hands, sore and cracked, his nails split and raw. And then there was the mask. It lay on the floor beside his bed. A clown mask, identical to the one Gacy wore in the video. The rubber was slick with blood, and the edges curled inward like a hungry mouth waiting to be fed. Peter stared at the mask in disbelief, bile rising in his throat. He didn't remember finding it. He didn't remember anything. The next morning, Peter sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the drawer where he had stashed the tape. He could feel it in there, humming like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a recording. It was something more, something alive. He knew deep down that watching the tape had been a mistake. Gacy's evil wasn't just contained within the footage. It was spreading, seeping into his mind, his body, his very skin. Peter rubbed at his arms, trying to shake the feeling that something was crawling beneath the surface. The bite marks throbbed and the corners of his mouth twitched, threatening to curl into another smile. And in the quiet of the morning, beneath the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock, Peter heard it again. A soft giggle. Somewhere deep inside him, Pogo was waking up. The dirt beneath Peter's nails wouldn't come off. No matter how much he scrubbed, it clung to his skin, filling the cracks of his fingers and burrowing under his nails. The dark grime reminded him of the mass graves he'd read about, the ones hidden beneath Gacy's house, where bodies had been stacked like firewood, forgotten beneath the earth. He tried to tell himself that the dirt was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, but he knew it was real, and the voice in his head, Pogo's voice, whispered the same thing every night. "You know where they are. They've been waiting for you." Peter stared at the map on his apartment wall, his hands trembling. Red circles marked each location connected to Gacy's murders. But the deeper Peter searched, the more patterns began to emerge. Patterns no one else had ever noticed. Some graves had been found, others remained hidden, but all of them aligned along an unsettling network of ley lines, cutting through the town like veins, pulsing with something ancient and malignant. At the center of it all was the ruins of Gacy's house, long since demolished, but Peter knew the truth. The house may be gone, but what lay beneath it was still alive. He felt it calling to him, tugging at the edges of his mind, like hands pulling him down into the earth. And with each passing day, the urge to dig grew stronger. It started with Site 21, an overgrown lot on the outskirts of town where Gacy's first victims had been discovered years ago. Peter arrived just before sunset, armed with a flashlight, a shovel, and a notebook filled with notes that made less and less sense the longer he stared at them. The land was wild and unkempt, the weeds waist-high and the ground soft beneath his boots. He knew he wasn't supposed to be here. The site had been officially closed after the remains were exhumed, but something told him the job had never really been finished, that there were more bodies beneath the earth than anyone knew. Peter's flashlight beam cut through the encroaching darkness, sweeping over the uneven ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and rot. As he knelt down and pressed his hand to the dirt, a chill ran through him, and for a moment he swore he could hear muffled voices, like whispers buried beneath the ground. "Help us!" Peter gasped, jerking his hand away, but the voices continued, soft and pleading, growing louder the longer he stayed. "We're still here. Dig us up. Dig us up." The words twisted inside his brain, filling every crevice with their desperate cries. His hands shook, but he couldn't resist. Before he knew what he was doing, Peter was digging, his fingers clawing into the soft earth, pulling up chunks of mud and stone. The shovel felt useless in his hands, too slow, too clumsy. He needed to feel the dirt beneath his nails, to touch what lay beneath the surface. The whispers grew louder, almost joyful now, and then, just as his fingers scraped against something hard, he felt it. A hand. It was cold and leathery, the skin stretched tight over bone. Peter stared in horror as he unearthed more of the corpse, revealing a grinning skull. Its jaw twisted into a rictus smile. The lips, what remained of them, had been sewn shut with thick black thread. Peter stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could fully comprehend what he was seeing, the hand twitched. The corpse moved ever so slightly, its skeletal fingers curling toward him. The grin on the skull seemed to widen, and in that moment, Peter knew. These weren't just dead bodies. They were something worse. They were waiting to come back. Peter staggered away from the grave, his mind spinning. He wiped his filthy hands on his pants, but the dirt seemed to cling tighter, as if it was embedding itself into his skin. His heart raced, and he could still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, tugging at his sanity. "We're still here." Back in his apartment, Peter paced the room, his thoughts spiraling out of control. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the grinning skull, the stitches pulling its lips into an eternal smile. Worse, he could still feel the hand's cold grip on his own, as if the touch had burned into his bones. He tried washing the dirt from his hands again, scrubbing until his skin was raw. But no matter how hard he tried, the grime remained. It had wormed its way beneath his skin, becoming a part of him. He could feel it crawling beneath his flesh, tiny movements like worms wriggling just beneath the surface. Peter collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. His arms ached and his fingers twitched involuntarily. He peeled back his sleeves and stared in horror at what he saw. Small, circular bruises had appeared along his arms, forming a jagged pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. A smile. It was as if the bruises were shaping themselves into Pogo's grin, spreading inch by inch across his skin. And then the worst realization hit him. He hadn't been alone at the grave. Something had followed him home. Peter became obsessed. He knew he couldn't stop. Not now. The bodies, the tunnels, the whispers, they were all connected. Something ancient lay beneath the town. Something hungry that had fed on Gacy's victims and now wanted more. And it wasn't just haunting him, it was becoming him. He spent hours researching old blueprints and maps of the area, tracing the tunnels that ran beneath Gacy's former house. They connected to other graves, other burial sites, each one like a waypoint in a network of death. And every line, every tunnel, led back to the ruins of Gacy's basement. That was where it all began, and that was where it had to end. But as Peter stared at the maps spread across his kitchen table, he felt something move beneath the skin of his arms again, this time more deliberate. The sensation was unbearable, like a million tiny insects burrowing deeper into his flesh. He scratched at his arms, desperate to stop the movement, but all he succeeded in doing was tearing his skin open, revealing black soil caked beneath the surface. His veins bulged, twisting in strange, unnatural patterns beneath his skin. The bruises had spread, forming a perfect grin across his chest, as if someone had stitched it into his body from the inside out. And in the silence of his apartment, he heard the giggle again. Software childlike. It was coming from inside him. Peter knew what he had to do. The tunnels beneath Gacy's house were still there, hidden beneath the ruins. He had to find them. He had to go deeper, down into the earth where the dead whispered and the hungry thing waited. He gathered his tools, a flashlight, a crowbar, a shovel, and headed out into the night. His arms ached with every step, the dirt beneath his skin grinding against his bones. But he didn't care anymore. There was no turning back. As Peter approached the ruins of Gacy's house, the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, alive with the whispers of the buried ones. The earth welcomed him, pulling him closer with every step, and somewhere deep in the darkness beneath the house, something stirred. It had been waiting for him all along. The earth was warm beneath Peter's fingers. It clung to his skin, wet and alive, like it was waiting for him. He knelt at the mouth of the tunnel beneath the ruins of Gacy's house, his flashlight flickering as if the air itself rejected light. Every breath was thick with rot and soil, as though the ground had opened up to swallow the living. He shouldn't have come here, but it was too late for regret. His veins throbbed with an unbearable pressure, his muscles spasming involuntarily. The skin along his arms itched and writhed, as if something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. He scratched until his nails bled, but the sensation only grew worse, spreading through his chest, his neck, his face. Every nerve screamed, but a new voice in his mind whispered over the pain. Almost there, just a little further. The tunnel walls were carved with clown faces, crude smiles chiseled into the stone, their hollow eyes watching Peter's descent. As he crawled deeper into the earth, he saw something moving ahead, just beyond the reach of his flickering flashlight. A shape, twitching, its limbs jerking unnaturally like a marionette held by invisible strings. Peter knew what it was before it even came into focus. It was Darren, or what was left of him. His skin hung in loose, pale sheets, sloughing off in patches, revealing blackened muscle beneath. His eyes were gone, sunken into the sockets, and his mouth had been torn into a jagged smile, stitched at the edges with thick, black thread. Darren's hands trembled violently, his limbs jerking as if controlled by something not entirely human. "You shouldn't have come," Darren rasped, the words slurred and wet, as though they'd been spoken through a mouth full of mud. He doesn't let go. Peter wanted to run, wanted to climb back out of the tunnel and flee into the night. But the tunnel seemed to stretch, the exit shrinking behind him, as if the earth had closed its mouth. There was no way out now. Darren took a shuddering breath. His stitched smile stretched further, tearing the corners of his mouth. Blood dripped down his chin, thick and black like oil. "He's inside you already," Darren whispered. "You feel it, don't you? The itch in your bones, the smile under your skin." Peter's hands trembled. He could feel it. The corners of his mouth twitched uncontrollably, his muscles pulling into a grin that wasn't his own. No matter how hard he tried to stop it, his lips curled upward, stretching wide, wider than they ever should. It hurt. His skin cracked, splitting at the edges, but the grin wouldn't stop. "You can't fight him," Darren said, laughing softly, weakly. "We're all just parts of the same joke, and the punchline is already written." With a sharp convulsion, Darren collapsed into the dirt, his body folding awkwardly, like a broken doll tossed aside. Peter stared at him, breathing hard, the grin still more stuck to his face. And somewhere deep in the tunnel, he heard the laughter again, soft at first, then louder, echoing through the walls. It wasn't just in the tunnel, it was in him. Peter stumbled further into the dark, his flashlight flickering until it died completely. But he didn't need it anymore. He could see now, perfectly, even in the pitch black. His eyes adjusted to the dark like a predator's, every shadow sharp, every corner clear. The walls of the tunnel closed in tighter, the dirt pressing against him, the ground sucking at his boots as he pushed forward. But it wasn't just the earth around him that felt alive. His own body was changing. His muscles stretched and twisted, his bones cracking painfully as if they were being reshaped from the inside out. His hands swelled and contorted, his fingers curling inward until they resembled claws. He tried to scream, but the sound that escaped wasn't his own voice. It was a high-pitched giggle, jagged and sharp, like nails scraping against glass. Peter's face burned as if fire was ripping through his skin. He clawed at his cheeks, feeling the flesh beneath stretch and sag. his lips now splitting open, peeled back into a grotesque grin, his jaw dislocating with a sickening pop. His tongue slithered against his teeth, which had begun to sharpen into points. Yellow and cracked, the clown inside him, Pogo, was taking shape. And the worst part, it felt right. Peter's heart slowed, the last traces of his resistance slipping away like sand through his fingers. His hands brushed against the clown's suit. Waiting for him in the dirt, a tattered, filthy costume stitched from patches of human skin. It was damp, warm to the touch, and when he lifted it, the suit pulsed beneath his hands. Alive. He knew without being told that this was the final step. If he put on the suit, there would be no turning back. Pogo would take over completely, and Peter Willis would cease to exist. For a moment, just a moment, he thought about resisting, about pulling himself out of the tunnel, clawing his way back to the surface and trying to live some kind of normal life. But then the whisper returned, soft and seductive. Why fight it, Peter? Smiling feels so much better. Peter slipped the suit over his trembling body. The fabric clung to his skin like a second layer, merging with his flesh, fusing to him. He felt the seams tighten, stitching into his muscles, binding him to the thing inside him. His spine twisted unnaturally, his limbs jerking into place as if he were a puppet on invisible strings. The painted grin stretched across his face, permanent now. The skin sewn so tight it felt like it would split his skull in half. His eyes burned, bright and glassy, reflecting the face of Pogo, the clown. His face etched with madness, and in that moment, Peter understood. He wasn't just possessed by Pogo. He was Pogo. The thing that had lived inside John Wayne Gacy hadn't died. It had simply waited for someone foolish enough to dig too deep, to pull at the threads of a nightmare that should have been left buried. Now it had found a new host, a new body, a new face. Peter, no, Pogo, staggered out of the tunnel, the night air thick with possibility. His joints ached, his bones felt brittle, but the grin never faltered. Laughter bubbled up from his chest, wild, uncontrollable, spilling from his lips in jagged bursts. It felt so good to laugh, and somewhere just beyond the town limits, he heard the faint sound of children playing. He began to walk toward them, his oversized shoes slapping against the dirt, his painted grin shining in the moonlight. He was hungry. And soon the world would know the punchline to Gacy's final joke, the joke that never ends. A week later, they found Peter's abandoned apartment, the door still locked from the inside. There was no sign of Peter himself, only a single object left sitting in the middle of the room. A VHS tape, labeled in messy handwriting, Pogo's Secrets. When the police played it, all they heard was laughter. High-pitched, shrill, endless laughter.